Welcome back to Cloud Computing and Big Data. This is lecture 11, and in the first part of this lecture, we talked about applications of association rule mining with big data, especially in cases where the big data is coming from retailers who are selling beauty products. In our case, this is the project that we worked on. In this part of the lecture, which is part 2, we're going to talk about deep data mining and deep learning for healthcare. But first, I'm going to provide a very short introduction to how cloud data mining works. So, if you've been on the internet for the last 10, 15 years, you've probably seen one of these captchas where on usually websites that are related to Google or other places on the internet, it asks you to show where the crosswalks are in a certain number of pictures, or where there's a fire hydrant, or where there's a bicycle or a motorbike, just to prove that you are not a robot, which serves a very good purpose. It tells a website that you are not a robot trying to crawl the internet and extract some data or steal it or do something with it. But at the same time, what this is doing also is providing Google with a bunch of images that are labeled by users. Because at some point, you can't constantly hire an army of people who just sit around all day clicking on images and trying to describe what is inside these images. What you can do is outsource it. And this is exactly what they did. So in this case, this collection of data is happening in order to improve models that are being developed within Google. This is probably for I think at a certain point, this was used to train their driverless cars. At other places, this is also used to train their object recognition, machine learning algorithms or deep learning algorithms. Mostly these are images where you have labels for these images, and these images can be used to train some kind of machine learning model. So the main aim for this is to generate labels and tags for products. In one application that we had in for example, in the On for Off project, was to use a off-the-shelf machine learning model to detect the contents of an image of, for example, a perfume bottle. And um, this tag that is generated by that off-the-shelf model, which has never been trained on these perfume bottles. It's just trying to predict what the bottle looks like. These tags are used then, collected, and then fed back into the website of that retailer to tell them if someone searches for a bottle and they say, for example, I want a bottle that looks like a high heel shoe, then they can easily find it because the algorithm was able to detect that this looks like a high heel shoe. So this is an application, for example, of images being used to generate labels and tags for searching on the website. This also is a way, data mining on the internet also helps in developing your natural language processing projects. For example, a lot of the natural language processing applications are being used that are using the Gutenberg online database, which is a collection of open source books or books that are outside of the copyright and are available freely. Some of them also train on the entirety of Wikipedia, which is a very good resource in terms of English language. The legality of this is uncertain, but since Wikipedia is open source, it seems to be a gray area. And with that in mind, you can see here at the bottom a basic implementation of what a convolutional neural network looks like. And this is something that we will talk about in the next couple of slides. So deep learning is one aspect of machine learning that is the next logical step to something that we called a shallow learner. Shallow, a shallow learner is something that is just used for classification, where a network built up of neurons, which because it's originally it was set up to mimic how the human brain processes information. So these layers are no more than one or two layers of neurons where an input is given with specific selected features. And then we ask those layers to give an output that helps us predict whether this is one thing or another, or maybe a multitude of things. Deep learning, on the other hand, takes it a couple of steps further by adding several layers in between the first input layer and the classifier, which is the last layer. The many, many layers in between are called hidden layers, and how they are affected by the input is not something that we understand to 100%, and also not something that we care about to 100%. The only thing we care about in this case is that the values within these internal layers do not blow up into infinity and do not go down all the way to zero. What we require them to be within a specific range, and there is a lot of work done in this case to avoid these either exploding gradient or vanishing gradients. And with that, we try to extract as much information as possible from the input in order to make sure that the classification at the end is as close as possible to the task that we set it to. Um, One tiny detail here is this last line where there is no universally accepted definition of how many layers constitute a deep learner. I've had people tell me that 4 layers is not deep, and I've had people tell me that 2 layers is already deep. So just whatever people say in this field, just take it with a grain of salt. I think through your experience, through hands-on work with deep learning, you'll develop your own idea of what counts as deep and not deep. And also, sometimes in your applications, a shallow learner probably performs better because, again, we go back to the idea of how many resources you're using for your learning. And also, there is this saying of like, it doesn't make sense to use a cannon if you want to kill a fly. So just use the proper tool for the proper task. Again, this is not something that you will know immediately from the get-go. This is something that you will develop a kind of feeling for as you start working in this field. So moving on, um, let's say one of the problems that we were facing during my PhD is this ability to detect conditions, medical conditions, from chest X-rays. A trained radiologist can look at an X-ray and tell immediately that there's something wrong with the left lung, for example, or there is some granularity that we should be able to detect. But a machine learning algorithm can definitely not do that just by looking at the picture. We need to give it a collection of data where it just looks at it several times, several examples of each class, as you can see here. And then based on these many iterations that it looks at these images, it develops an idea of what, let's say, a healthy lung should look like, or a pneumonia, or a lung affected by pneumonia should look like. This is specifically interesting because during the COVID pandemic, there was excessive pressure on the ICU to be able to detect whether a patient has COVID or not. And the early detection for COVID was very closely related to survival from COVID. So being able to quickly and effectively detect a COVID-19 infection was a life or death situation here. It it helped heal patients quickly or like give them the proper treatment without scrambling to give some medication that might actually not be suited for the condition that they're in. So, um, okay, so your task is to train that model to be able to detect whether a patient has a healthy lung on online repositories of medical images. But before that, there was no way to recognize what COVID-19 looks like in the lungs. So, what do you do in those situations? Is the data that you have properly labeled for the task at hand? Maybe some conditions are mislabeled, maybe some of them are labeled multiple times, or the same image appears multiple times. In this case, all of this can be resolved by following a standardized, a comprehensive approach to solving your problem. In this case, we'll refer to the CRISP-DM documentation, which we'll talk to later in these slides, but it's mostly a standardized way of approaching a machine learning task where you understand the problem, then you understand the data, then you adjust your understanding of the problem based on what you already know about the data, and then you iterate one, two, three, four times as much as you need to be able to solve the problem at hand. So CNNs, and this is just a callback to the lectures 6 and 7, where you saw how CNNs and residual networks work. So CNNs are models that are really good at detecting objects in images. And they've been established for a very long time, starting with the initial paper by, I think, Jan Lequin, and who is currently, by the way, the lead AI engineer at Meta, Facebook. And they're doing a lot of work in machine learning, but mostly this initial step towards looking at images was a groundbreaking effort, and it led to the world that we live in right now, where you have image detection, object detection from images. And this approach works by looking at the initial image, breaking it down into many features, and then breaking those features down into more features, simplifying, extracting information, and then um, putting it all back together into flattened layers, fully connected layers that are similar to the basic neurons that we discussed in the previous slides, basic layers. And then at the end, we have a classification layer, which tells you if this is an image of a car, a truck, a van. Um, this, for example, is a very basic implementation of what a CNN looks like, but there are different implementations since then that perform better or perform differently for different tasks. One such example is given here, which is the ResNet, which is short for residual network. And ResNet 50, for example, is the model that won the IAAS VRC, which is the image classification task um, for 2015. What this model does is it is trained on the ImageNet, which is a large database of images, which has images of very random day-to-day objects, dogs, cats, different breeds of dogs, different breeds of cats, different birds, trees, flowers, a million objects. And at the end of it, the model is expected to perform on new images that it has never seen. And how well it performs on these images defines how well it performs on this ILS VRC classification task. In 2015, the ResNet 50 won this task because it performed very well, and it implemented this residual um, layer approach, where there is a residual connection that tries to avoid that these layers either go to infinity or go to zero by bypassing them and making sure that the flow of information through the network is not lost at some point. So ResNet 50 is one of the models that I worked with, and very similarly to ResNet 50, there is the COVIDNet, which is a network that was trained and released into the world. This model was trained on pictures from COVID-19, and it was one of the best performing models for detecting COVID-19 from chest X-rays. So COVIDNet itself was also released in parallel with the COVIDX dataset, making it a very useful resource. Because even if you don't want to use that specific model, you can train your own model on the dataset that they used and compare your results to theirs. But this COVIDNet also implemented a residual layer approach, just like the one given in the ResNet 50. Um, our practical example here is that we implemented COVIDNet in our research. This is one of the projects that I was working on in parallel to my main project with which we'll talk about later. But in this case, COVIDNet was taken as is, pre-trained using the weights that were given by the original authors. But we wanted to implement it to new data that it has never seen. And we wanted to make sure that it works with the data that we have. The challenge here is that the data that we have is of quite lower quality because it's taken from hospitals that don't have the large storage or the um, excessive amounts of computing power to be able to process large images for X-rays. So they're stored in a lower quality format. They have quite lower resolution. And so it was a major task for us to retrain this COVIDNet on its original data with with a smaller input. So we had to reduce the size of the inputs so that it coincides relatively well with the data that we have from our research partner. In this case, they were called EHL. Um, so, how do we go about doing that? Also, since we are trying to retrain a model, it makes sense to be able to perform this training in different iterations, try to see how changing some parameters affects the results from the training. And so we also performed an implementation of hyperparameter tuning, which I guess is going to be the topic of one of the future lessons in this course. So I won't go into too much details about that part here, but I will go into details of how the training for this specific model was done. In this case, we implemented a transfer learning approach where we took the COVIDNet, we cut off the built-in classification layer that it has, which has three classes, either pneumonia, COVID-19, and healthy, and replaced it with our own classification layer, which, yes, in this case, it was still COVID-19, pneumonia, or healthy, but it was also potentially scalable to more conditions because the data that we had from our research partner had a lot more conditions, including collapsed lung, trauma to the lungs, maybe liquid intrusion into the lungs, ARDS. So in this case, the model would be trained taking the original weights. We either freeze them or freeze or unfreeze these layers. And I'll also go into the details of what this means. But the original model is taken as is, and then the last part is replaced. And then we do a number of trainings. So one of the training was the model as is with the new classification layer. So we train this classification layer to be able to detect. If it performs well, great. If it doesn't, then we go back to the original model and unfreeze one of the layers, meaning that during training, that layer can also be changed based on the outputs from the classes and how close they are to the original data. How well this model predicts affects how much this layer that is unfrozen is adjusted, tweaked, to be able to produce better results. And several training iterations are done where we go back through the entire model and unfreeze layer by layer to be able to see what kind of change we can do to the model itself to improve its outputs based on our own data. Um, our training and testing data was also of a limited size, so it wasn't comparable that much to the data given from the COVID-X data set, but it was enough to uh, train an initial model or like combine with the COVID-X data set. It was enough to do an initial training, and the results were promising. So this approach where you take an original trained model and use the major part of it without the classification layer for a new classification task is called transfer learning, where you just transfer the knowledge from a previous application field into a new application field. There is another example of this where you take a model that is trained on detecting random images of cats, dogs, and trees, flowers, leaves, and apply it specifically to detecting different breeds of dog. In that case, this is also another transfer learning approach where the original domain was random images of nature, and then the new specific domain is purely dogs. You'll see a lot of applications of transfer learning in the field where it doesn't make sense to retrain your own model from scratch on the data that you have because sometimes the data you have is not enough. Sometimes the data you have is not good enough for the practical approach, but it is good enough to nudge a model that already has some notion of the different, like the existence of different things. So maybe your data has enough information in it to nudge it in the direction of of your task, so it performs better than a model that is trained from scratch on your data. Moving on, another practical example is the application for detection of ARDS. In this case, the model was not an image detection model, but rather a sequence detection model or classification, yes, but from numerical data. So we looked at several different parameters, including hemoglobin concentration in the blood, the oxygenation of the patient, their how many heartbeats they have, how much they're breathing, how much oxygen there is in the blood. And all of this data is fed into a one-dimensional convolutional layer, which is a model, sorry, which is a model that is good at working with sequence data. Now, in this case, we were lucky enough to have an original model that was a purely mathematical model that was able to mimic the human physiology. And in that case, we were able to feed a lot of potential patients into that model and get the outputs from it. So in this case, because we didn't have enough data from our databases of what patients look like, or maybe that data didn't cover all of the bases, we were able to mathematically and statistically uh, generate as much data as we need to fill all of the blanks that our original data couldn't. And based on that, train a machine learning model that just does the basic task of a black box where you feed it, this is the current state of the patient. In 5 minutes, what will happen to them? So that model trained well, and it was able to almost 99% mimic the operation of that computational model, the mathematical model. Um, And it was more lightweight and much faster because it didn't go through all of these mathematical calculations and breathing cycles of what the patient is going through. It just worked as a black box, input, output. In this case, the original data that we had was data available through the Mimic 3 database, which is a resource available online. It's a resource of medical information, signals, and images from taken from only one hospital here, and we'll talk about that later. But this is just one hospital somewhere in the United States, and the data there is compiled over 10 years, and there's a lot of data that can be used to train a deep learning model. There is enough data there. You have to go through it and you have to clean it and you have to prepare it, which we had to do. But in this instance of data mining, this is a very useful resource. In our case, also, we had access to some data from local clinics here in Germany. But again, since this is the medical field, access to medical data is always it always comes with some caveats where you probably shouldn't be using it to 100% with your learning model because sometimes patients just opt out of these. Maybe they gave their permission to use the data, but after a certain time, that permission was taken away. So how do you deal with that? You have to always wear some gloves while dealing with this data, and you also have to provide 100% proof that there is no way for this model to be able to predict who the patient is, because we also want to preserve anonymity of the patients. There is a lot of fear in this case for medical data. So again, this explains why we would use openly available data on the internet. Um, and in this case also, it makes sense that we were able to create our own data because that solves a major problem with data unavailability. Um, Now, the problem with using the Mimic 3 database is that this is data from only one hospital, as I mentioned. So it introduces a major bias where um, it's not 100% sure that the hospital that you might want to apply this model in will have the same protocols as the data that is as the hospital where this data was collected. So you might have a very well-performing model on that data, but it won't work on your own. So in this case, you will still have to do some version of transfer learning or maybe tuning to be able to implement this model in the end place that you're going to implement it. At the same time, also, like this bias is probably not 100% clear or understandable. So always maybe implement this model implement your models with this database or openly available databases as a test, and then curate your own data for when you want to train properly. So the model that we implemented had 25 million trainable parameters. And this was a very small model. Going back to ResNet had 50 layers, whereas this one had only 5 layers. And you can imagine how much larger the ResNet would be than this model. And even with this, in this case, these 25 billion trainable parameters took quite a while to train. In our case, we were lucky to have access to HPC resources at the Jülich Supercomputing Center, but you might not have that resource available, and you will have to depend on cloud services like Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, or Amazon Web Services. In this case, it makes sense that also you use the most efficient method. Again, I will repeat myself several times on this, but it makes sense also to be conscious of your approach, not just throwing any random model that performs well on the data. Even if it's going to perform well, that doesn't mean that it's going to perform because it's going to be excessively costly to train and run this model. But still, sometimes if you have no other recourse, you have to use these resources, and it makes sense anyway that they are available, which this is a very good thing that we have because we have access to these resources now. Before it was you had to apply for funding, you have to apply for a spot at a research center to be able to run your code, and that was a whole hassle. So, I mean, great that this is available, but use it uh, with an open mind. Now, when you collect data from the internet, sometimes one of the things that you deal with is lack of data. And it doesn't make sense to keep copying your images, for example, and then training on them, because at some point, what you have in the end is a model that is very good at recognizing this one image and nothing else. It will, in the end, this is a model that's supposed to, machine learning models in general, they are supposed to find the quickest solution to the problem. The minimum effort, minimum energy expended to be able to solve this one problem. So the minimum effort thing is to expect that all of the images I'm going to get are going to be images that look like this. So I will 100% remember this image and like if the image doesn't look like this, it will definitely be expected to be this image. So you always need to have images that are random, that are of many different classes. Never train on the same image more than once. Uh, I mean, if you have access to more images, great. You have solved the problem of data mining, but in most cases, you don't have access to a lot of images. So what you can do is generate your own images. Generating images here could be, in our case, mathematically or statistically similar images or data, or it could be a simple question of rotating the image, flipping it, doing some introducing some blur, introducing some uh, new aspects to the image, cropping it, moving it around so that you make your model a bit more robust. This will help, definitely, but only to a certain extent. This doesn't solve your lack of data problem. This only mitigates some of the problems until you can have more data. But yeah, data augmentation, and which is what we're discussing here, is one of the ways that you can solve the lack of data or having sparse data. But more importantly, and this is the thing that I mentioned earlier in the first part of this lesson, it is more important to understand the application that you're going for. And this is where the CRISP-DM process comes into play. So as I mentioned, the CRISP-DM model is the standard framework of dealing with data mining and data processing applications. This is specifically for for the field of machine learning, but it might apply to other fields. In this case, we're not concerned with other fields, we're concerned with our own, and this is the whole idea. So you understand your project, you understand your data, and then using that understanding, you go back to your project, try to update it, try to change some things in it, adapt it to what you already know about your data, and then go back again through the data understanding. Keep repeating this until you are 100% sure that your application is the best application to the data that you have. And the data that you have extracted specifically the parts that you need for your project that you're trying to implement. From there, you prepare that data and you do the modeling. You implement your model to your data and you predict, you extract resources, you extract information, you do the work, and you evaluate how well did it work. Did it operate badly? Go back to the original part and then try to understand your model better, try to understand your data better, and go through the whole process again. When that is done, when you are 100% sure that your model works, your implementation is good, everything works, then you can move on to deployment. And In all of your projects, I think this is the best thing that you can do. Uh, iterate, iterate, iterate all the time until you are sure that your approach is logical, it makes sense, it doesn't use up too many resources, but also it doesn't try to solve a problem in a very awkward way. And always go back to the original Occam's razor, which is that the simplest solution is often the best. Your job is to find out what the simplest solution is, and it's also your job to implement it and find the best way to implement it. So the whole idea is the whole idea from our learning tasks here is to use a set of observation to uncover underlying processes. So you're trying to extract some information to be able to guess how something works, to be able to mimic how that thing works. Um, and this is the main mantra of unsupervised learning. Um, and there are three different approaches to learning where there's supervised learning, where you're the one constantly nudging the model in one direction or the other. There's unsupervised learning, where you let the model on its own guess where it needs to go. And there's reinforcement learning, where you are um, teacher and then the model is is a student. It depends on which one of these fields you apply or which one of these fields you're working in. Your approach needs to change, your approach needs to adapt to it. But all in all, in all of these applications, you're going to need a lot of data. And this is why data mining and access to large scale databases on the internet is very important. It's very interesting for your field. And you slowly develop this portfolio of all of these places where you can get data specifically for the application at hand. Um, our part and our work here in, let's say, in my field, but also in machine learning, is to set up collaborations. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is research done in Germany, but it's mostly, but it's also related to the work being done by the IHPC community in Iceland, which is the National Competence Center for HPC and AI in Iceland. And this is an EU-funded project. In this case, we've collaborated a lot between the Yale Supercomputing Center and the University of Iceland. Our part of it is the AI for Health and Medicine Simulation Data Lab. This is the lab that Morris and I and some members of the medical community in Germany are working in. And we're setting up collaborations with Iceland, but also within Germany and within the European Union. These kind of collaborations are very important because through these collaborations, you develop a sense of what the community needs, what kind of problems you can solve, and with the collaboration, within the collaboration with HPC experts, with AI experts, with people who are in the medical field, you also know the methods with which you can solve these problems. So this collaboration in general is the key term in all of these situations. And if you have been following the news, you'll see that collaboration is also one of the major things that drives our industry forward. I'll leave you, this is the last part of the lesson, but I'll leave you with these couple of snippets from the news, recently publications, two of which are from 2021 and one from 2023. These are applications of machine learning and data mining on a large scale. The first two are the protein folding applications, one from Google's DeepMind, and the other one is from the Baker Lab at the University of Washington. If you've also been following the news, the authors of these papers, well, the lab directors of the places where these papers were written and these results were developed, were the current, like they were awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for trying to solve the protein structure prediction problem, which has plagued scientists for the last 50 years, I think. They are John Jumper and Demis Hassabis from DeepMind, and David Baker from the Baker Lab in the University of Washington. So there is a lot of work being done in this field, and there is a lot of recognition that can be accrued in this field as well. At the same time, I'm only mentioning Llama here, but there's a lot of work being done currently on large language models. And love them or hate them, they are a major part of machine learning and data mining specifically, because a lot of these models have to have a lot of good data that is very well trimmed, very well manicured, so that these models can perform well. In their paper on Llama, when it was published, the authors were very clear on where the data came from, and they were very clear that their data was specifically open source, which sets their model apart, but also, I mean, they used the Wikipedia data, and again, like this is the authors of those Wikipedia pages may not have been informed that their data would be used to train a model. So again, there is this question here, but it's good to see that there is some move in the industry for using open data and also having open data repositories for training these models. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done. There is a lot of work that is being done, and there is a lot of work that you guys will be able to do in this field. And with that, I get to the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and here's a quick walk through our bibliography. And in the last page, you will see my face as well as other people from the research group who are working on very interesting topics and some of our projects and some of our activities in the last couple of years in Iceland and outside. And so I thank you all for listening, and I hope this has been a very interesting lesson for all of you.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Doc Chadi. These have been interesting times and very good times. Very nice to see that one PhD finishes, and it was a very good presentation. Thank you very much. So yeah, you see here on the page, of course, also PhD retreat. So it's not only hard work that Chadi has to do. So sometimes we had also the pleasure being at the PhD retreats. Hence, I hope the PhD journey was also nice for you, Chadi, and you could advise maybe some students that would be interested in Iceland to do a PhD. I would then relate them to you and would, say they should talk to you a little bit how the life really is of PhDing in Iceland. You had a very specific combination also with Germany in a collaboration, but as you pointed out, international collaboration is key, and collaboration at all is also important. And as you said, with the community building, I think that was also a very good theme. I think almost all students know that by now. They're participating in the HPC workshops already. So it's also a very important model to really get you into collaboration schemes, see different industry vendors, public organizations, SMEs at these events to see the topic is quite broad when you talk about cloud computing, big data, HPC, etc. Right. But yeah, once again, I thank you very much, Chadi. And I think we close here then with the lecture. And next time we have lecture 12 on container technologies. So see you then.